right. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. This is great to finally meet you. This is how we meet each other nowadays, through Zoom. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization and what you're passionate about?
Sure. Well, I guess where to start? I feel like I'm kind of a dinosaur in the energy space. I've been in energy, specifically electricity, I was talking to someone earlier today, and I actually had to do the math, and I realized I've been doing this for almost 30 years. Um, but
Wow. Try not to admit that, right?
Yeah,
I know the feeling.
it's a stark realization when it kind of hits you in the face like that. So, but it's uh, you know, super interested in this space, kind of right place at the right time. Got involved with it right when it was starting to open up at the federal level in the mid '90s, kind of early '90s, mid '90s, and it's been this super interesting evolution as time has gone on. It's undergone so many evolutions just in the last 30 years that I've been involved with it, to say nothing of the stark changes that happened before my time. But super interested to see all the technological innovation that's come into this space, and I think that the applied technologies, you're really seeing them make their way into the energy side probably more dramatically than people really think that they are. So material sciences being a huge part of what we're seeing here, and some of those changes, along with just absolute technological innovation and computation capacity to model different types of things and to really stretch and get the most out of what we have from an infrastructure perspective and predictability associated with what we're going to be doing here. So it's been a ton of fun, and I'm fortunate enough that I'm one of those people that I don't think I've convinced myself to the contrary, but I happen to find myself in an industry that I really have a lot of excitement about, and it's an awesome thing for you wake up and it's not always the same thing, different day in this business for sure.
Yeah, but I mean, I always think that this is really sort of like the foundational underpinning of everything, right? Is energy, right? Because
Yeah,
everything needs power. Everything
right.
needs power, and innovations in power will just let us. If you think about uh, everything requires that innovation to take the next step and the next step. We wouldn't have the phones that we have today if we not had the innovations in power. We wouldn't have a lot of the technology that we had today if it wasn't for the innovations in power. So it really is sort of the foundational piece that's driving almost everything.
It's one of those really strange things that I think that particularly we're moving into these different periods of time where there's concern about shortages and how are we doing from an infrastructure perspective. Some of these concerns that they haven't made their way into the public domain for a long time. But electricity is one of these weird things. I mean, I can't really speak to gasoline or crude oil, the rest of it. I'm mostly a power and natural gas person. But you're absolutely right. We have familiarity with it, I think, because people are so accustomed to dealing with electric this and this and this. But there's a very sort of, and it's because it works the way it's supposed to work. People have a very shallow understanding of how all this stuff works. Like intuitively, well, there's a power plant somewhere, and then like it delivers electricity to me. And it's a very rudimentary understanding, but it's one of those things that we just deal with so frequently, and it's very much out of sight, out of mind. But your point is absolutely right. I mean, if you really think about it, the totality of our entire modern way of life is dependent upon our electricity infrastructure and having reliable, inexpensive access to electricity. I mean, you can't, I live in Houston, and it's pretty dense. All these dense urban areas, like if you don't have pumps that are moving water to houses, and you don't have, like here, it would be miserable to live here without air conditioning. You just couldn't do it. Like you'd have to be, spread out. You'd have to have a lot of land, and we wouldn't be able to, have the density. So we don't think about it a lot, but it's fundamental to, the way everything, our modern lifestyles.
Right. And if you think about it, the innovations in battery power or batteries and technology and that kind of mobile, like we wouldn't have smartphones like we have today if we didn't have the innovations in power,
For
right?
sure.
Because you'd have to just keep plugging it in. I mean, we're not where we are without that foundation. So I have a feeling that people sort of like discount it as, oh, that's so boring. But if you ask me, that's where the real innovation, the more innovation that happens in that space, the further and further we can go doing other things, because everything just layers on top of that.
Yeah, and it's everything from, propulsion, how we move ourselves around, and some of the goals that we want to end up having. And we really have to have a culture of investing in research and development and commercializing these technologies. I think in many respects, the industry as a whole does a very good job of commercializing technologies when they're ripe to be commercialized. I always sort of chuckle to myself. I can't speak to other industries, but there's this whole notion of all the money grubbing, the big electricity or whatever that's, trying to get access to some patent
Is
to,
that a thing? Big electricity?
no,
That's an actual thing.
I don't know. But there's this idea that, oh, these power companies don't want you to know because there's some, perpetual motion machine that they bought the patents up and they put it on a shelf or something like that. This industry doesn't work that way at all. If somebody has a better mousetrap, it's so easy for them to bring those things to the forefront, and a better ideas win every time. And so we've seen this, there are questions, why do we move from coal-fired generation as kind of our backbone generation fuel into combined cycle technology, which is gas turbines, and they're recovering waste heat, very efficient. Well, it was a better mousetrap. It's not because folks are like, hey, we got to have, less CO2, or we got to have, and those are definitely factors, but the main factor was it was just a better design. And so we've seen that, consistently as time has gone on, where there are better mousetraps that are brought in. It's a real industry where you can be rewarded for bringing some new technological innovation that can be commercialized in this space. So it's very, very dynamic, and it's a neat thing, and a fun place to be.
Yeah, that for some reason that reminds me of. I had a friend of mine in high school who said that he had an uncle who had a patent on something that would use water to generate power, but the oil companies bought it off him and buried it. And I'm like, that cat doesn't sound real.
For sure. Yeah, it's funny, but people have ideas about stuff, and everyone loves a good conspiracy, and there's a lot of entertainment in movies and television that have that as a predator. And sometimes, truth is stranger than fiction, but in this space, at least from, my close observation, that's not been the norm here. So
So where do you think we are right now? I mean, what technologies are being most used today? Because I sometimes I see these memes on the internet where they have like a Tesla being charged by an electric, like a generator, and where they're talking about, I've got this electric car and I'm feeling really good about myself, but where's the electricity coming from? Coal-fired plant, right? So, I mean, where is most electricity coming from? Is it still coal, or do we have cleaner alternatives?
it's highly regionalized. I mean, that's one of the things I think we really we get used to thinking of things as nationwide. I might have AT&T or Verizon and they cover me coast to coast, but electricity is very much a regional thing, and there's a number of reasons for that. So the geography is certainly very important. We actually have separate electricity grids, for lack of a better term. We have different interconnections in North America. In the United States, we actually have portions of the country that are split into three different systems. And some of those are political reasons, some of those are really physical reasons. There's a real logistics reason for that, but we have differences across the board. So if we were to look at, and starting in the West, in the Pacific Northwest, for example, and we have a tremendous amount of hydroelectric generation in that area. The Bonneville Power Administration, there are a number of municipal utilities up there along the Columbia River, generate a tremendous amount of hydroelectric generation. And to the north in British Columbia, they generate a tremendous amount of hydroelectric generation there as well. So in those areas, predominantly we generate. There's definitely some coal plants. There's some gas plants. You can't get by with only one for all intents and purposes, generally speaking, because of variability in what you're getting. But that's where that is. Within California, and as you move your way down into the mid portions of the West Coast, down into the desert Southwest, we have very large nuclear generating facility down in Palo Verde. There historically were several nuclear facilities along up the western seaboard, so to speak. There's been some talk about retiring some of those. The bulk of that generation's out there is going to be, there's definitely some coal that's left out there, but a lot of that is just kind of getting to the end of its economic useful life, where the cost to maintain and keep up with them. And up until recently, natural gas has been very inexpensive relative to where it's been historically. And so it's displaced a lot of coal-fired generation in that part of the country. So a lot of hydroelectric generation. We have a lot of natural gas-fired generation. There's quite a bit of nuclear on a percentage basis, relative to some of the other parts of the country. Texas is, or the bulk of the state of Texas is in its own system. And so for us here, about 47%, I think that's right, 44% of our electricity is natural gas fired between the efficient combined cycle, where it's recovering waste heat, some of those types of things, and cogeneration facilities, along with jet engines for peak periods. It's a little under half.
Jet engines? How do you use jet engines for power
So that's
generation?
actually how the combustion turbines work. So these big jet engines, they're industrial scale, and they've got a shaft that runs through them. And then the other end is a generator. So it literally, there are power plants that they call them aeroderivatives. So they're very similar to what you would get on maybe a big 747 or some of these commercial airliners, that it has a generator package on the back end of it. And those are very, very useful for their very quick start. You can get your electricity very, very quickly in response to increase in demand, or if you have an outage of another power plant. They're not quite as efficient, so they burn more fuel. But the other types that use those same combustion turbines, those same jet engines, they actually recover a lot of the exhaust heat, and then it makes steam and it makes more electricity. So they're much more efficient. They call those combined cycle. So we have a lot of combined cycle here in Texas, and that's really most of the natural gas facilities that have been built since the late 80s. A big fraction of those are these efficient, very clean burning natural gas fired facilities. And so we have a large proportion of that. We actually have a tremendous amount of wind, and we're picking up quite a bit of solar as well. So we have a very large amount of that. We have 2 large nuclear facilities here in Texas. And then we have some coal that's left over. It's it's not on a percentage basis kind of what we see in the eastern United States. And as we move, further out into the east, there's a far bigger proportion of that generation infrastructure is coal, but a lot of it's been retired here in the last several years because there was a big capacity glut, and the cost to keeping these things up and running, and they weren't making sense from an economics perspective. So a lot of natural gas in Florida, and then we get sort of in coal and nuclear facilities. Really pretty much across the eastern United States. So the percentage of coal there is a little bit heavier, but it's been changing. It's been changing in response to just basic economics, having nothing to do with, necessarily a policy with its thumb on the scale in one place or the other. That's been happening, but we've been really picking up and meeting all the increased demand that we've had as a country over the course of the last 20 years. And we've been doing that pretty efficiently with these, brand new state-of-the-art types of facilities, and displacing some of the older, dirtier stuff along the way.
Well, so what's going in instead of the coal?
So quite a bit, if you were to go back 10 years ago, the vast majority of what was built was natural gas-fired combined cycle facilities and peaking. Those are So one of the things I think people have a fundamental misunderstanding about: electricity is really this weird thing. And I think we all know it's kind of strange, but if we think about it, it's the ultimate just-in-time inventory commodity. Like it's produced, distributed, and consumed at the speed of light. And so from a grid scale, we don't really have a way to store electricity as electricity very well. So what that means is that when people use electricity, the systems have to produce basically in balance exactly what's being required. So, to a certain extent, people may not really believe this, but if you flip the light switch, unless someone else has turned a light switch off someplace else, a power plant somewhere has to move a minuscule amount to meet that incremental demand that you put on the system. We can't store some of it and make it up later, or do some of these other types of things. So what happens is that we really have 2 different classifications of power plants that we have been building. So on the one hand, the traditional power plants were ones that we would call dispatchable. It has design characteristics. We want it to produce, let's just say 200 megawatts. We actually give it the input to output 200 megawatts, and it'll give us 200 megawatts unless there's some kind of an operational issue. And then we have the non-dispatchable resources, like some of the renewables would be wind and solar. So oftentimes what I hear people with their quick math is, okay, so hey, in Texas, last month we consumed, just make up a number, 300,000 or 3 million megawatt hours. Well, if these wind plants can run at this period of time, it can make 3 million megawatt hours. And that math actually doesn't work operationally. You have to deliver it when it's needed, like exactly at that time. So what's been going on is there's a real need. There's been this large increases in the amount of renewable capacity, particularly wind, that's been put in place. But wind kind of needs to have its friends take up the slack. And so what happens, and we see this in Texas, is we have such a gargantuan amount of our capacity here. Texas is the 5th largest producer of wind in the world, wind electricity.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, so I think like China and Germany and India, and then the United States, and then Texas is obviously in the denominator of the United States, and then Texas is by itself. We have a huge amount of wind capacity here, and we have a pretty significant amount of solar now as well. So we have a lot of renewables, and so much so that when they're all on, it creates problems for the regular fleet, and then sometimes when they're not on, the regular fleet, the traditional dispatchable fleet, really struggles to make up for what's happening there. So there needs to be a good interplay of, as long as, and we're better off. Like, we would rather have, say, even if you don't add any value to carbon, on economics, if you just think about it for a second, as long as your cost to install renewable energy is in line-ish with some of these other power plants, even though it has these other operational problems, the good news is the fuel is free. All these other plants, you have to transport fuels, and there's a cost associated with fuels. With these other ones,
exactly,
the fuel is free. So it definitely has its place, and there's an economic value. The real struggle is them not being dispatchable and not being there when they really need to be there. So, and we've become accustomed to being able to have electricity on a reliable basis, on a relatively cost-effective basis, and so it's something the industry is trying to work through, of how to, you're trying to serve a bunch of masters and find these good solutions. But I think that, again, as we talked about at the very beginning, what will happen is that technology and the advancement in these emergent technologies and commercializing these technologies is going to be the thing that allows us to really make those transitions. I think there is a real danger of trying to push some of these transitions faster than we're really ready for. And it can it be done? Sure, but we just may not have reliable electricity, and that may sort of result in some other types of issues. So, but the biggest key that I think the renewable energy universe is waiting for, at least with the technologies that have been deployed today, really has to do with how do we store and have a buffer around these things, and what's the right kind of technology? Is it batteries? Is it some kind of a kinetic storage, like a big flywheel? Is it, we do this already with what they call them pump storage facilities, where nighttime power used to be around a lot of excess nuclear energy. In the nighttime, they would pump water up a mountain and to a big reservoir, and then they have it available as synthetic hydroelectric generation during the daytime. But not every place has the geography that allows that to happen. So it's not really appropriate in every part of the country as well. So there's a big race that's going on today to figure out what are the right technologies to store electricity, because once that happens, and once we can do that on a cost-effective basis, I do think that we can really see some of these renewable technologies take off, while at the same time it being cost-effective for us in this country.
So I've seen something. So the batteries definitely, but I've seen this thing where there's like what do you call those things? Like shafts. Yeah, there's like shafts with pulleys, and there's weights. Yeah. And is that another example of the kinetic one you're talking about?
For sure, okay. For sure. Mm-hmm. And those are all ones where, in a battery, you're taking electricity, you're storing it as chemical energy, and you're converting it back into electricity. And some of these other ones, you're converting it into kinetic energy, and then you're converting it back. So, and there's a penalty sometimes in the conversion of one form to another form, but
Oh yeah, we haven't envisioned the perpetual motion machine yet.
Not
right?
quite yet. Yeah, not quite yet. So, but there's a bunch of really, I mean, there's some even older technologies called compressed air energy storage. And those are ones where you take excess electricity and you use that to compress air into a salt dome or some other type of, and then when you want to get it back out, you use half of the combustion turbine, and then you just use a tiny amount of fuel, and you get a lot of output, because most of the work that a jet engine is doing is compressing air for its own combustion purposes. So there's tons of technologies that are just all kind of in this race to see which one is going to be commercialized first on a cost-effective basis. So that's why I said it's a fun time to be in this space.
Yeah, and on the other side, we're all working to make things more and more energy efficient. Because I'm thinking there's this sort of sweet spot, right? Because we're generating energy from one end, and we're consuming energy on the other end. And at some point, these things are going to meet, and we'll be like, that'll be the sweet spot, and we'll be good, right? So we have to work both directions.
It's truly amazing. When I was growing up in this space, maybe some of the viewers, listeners are too young, but the 90s.com era, like I still tell my kids sometimes, and they don't really understand, like when I started working in the mid 90s, we didn't have web access. Like we had emails, and it was like a novelty. Some people had cell phones, you're beyond the brick thing, but when I'm telling them stories as a kid, like, well, why didn't you just call them on your phone? Like we didn't have those, right? So that kind of wasn't a thing. But in the 90s, there was a huge increase just because we started to have a lot of these electronics in the home, the Blu-ray players. We moved away from the VHS, and this huge explosion in in-home devices, and loads really took off, right? Everyone had a desktop at home, not just your laptop that you took around with you. And so
with that CRT, which sucked up a lot of juice, right? Not the LCD
right,
panels we have today.
Yeah, with a big CD-ROM player on the side, and you name it. So, but it's amazing to have seen what's happened really since the end of the 90s. With over the years, we've had this economic output, even normalizing for 2008 and some of the global financial crisis and some of those things. You've seen GDP growth, but you never saw the pace of electricity demand keep up quite the same way. And one of the things that's been really interesting that I've been able to do with the company that we have here, EnergyOgre, is we help people with their electricity plans and their residential. Like we have competition here in Texas, and we assist people. One of the things we get out of that is really looking at energy efficiency. We take a deep dive on how people use electricity, how much are they using on a per square foot basis versus a reference case. And the newer homes, the homes that have been built since, in the mid 90s or since the mid 2000s, unbelievably energy efficient in comparison. I mean, if I can show you a house that's, a 5,000 square foot newly built house with, the existing code, and its electricity consumption, it may be less than what an old 1,800 square foot house that's not air conditioned, not insulated properly, and has a 35-year-old air conditioning compressor. It's amazing the efficiency standards and what's actually been done on the other side. So we've really pushed the envelope on a lot of these things, and that hasn't been waiting for the supply side to catch up. That's been really going on in earnest for at least the last 20 years.
Yeah, I'm waiting for the day when I walk into a new home and all I see are USB ports, no actual outlets, right? Because almost everything's running on USB now.
That's true.
What is that? Is that 5 volts or something like that? Is some right. minuscule amount of power?
What's interesting, here in the Houston area, historically, unlike North Texas, most of us here, if you look at any of the older homes, they have a lot of natural gas in, maybe natural gas heaters, and we might have natural gas cooktops. And if you go into the new homes, they're all electric. And I was like, that doesn't make any sense. Just thinking to myself, just from a cost perspective of where some of these rates look like. And someone who's in the industry that is really on top of these building standards explained it to me. They're like, hey, these homes are so energy efficient, and the envelopes, the amount of air that penetrates, they're very, very airtight. And so you can't be combusting a whole bunch of these gases. You can't be introducing carbon monoxide and big amounts of carbon dioxide into these enclosed spaces. Like, well, now I understand it. So one of the ways that you have very energy efficient homes is you limit the amount of air that's able to pass through them from the outside, and you have these other kind of strange effects. But that's how big of a difference it is.
Well, that makes sense, but then I wouldn't have a gas stove, and I need a gas stove, damn it.
That's right. That's right. I think I was listening to someone. I talked to a lady that was having this home built, and she's like, I adamantly, and I don't know why in Houston this is a big deal, but she had to have a gas fireplace. And so there's actually a way to do that where you put it behind glass so the heat radiates through, but the actual exhaust gases go up a real chimney. So she was happy.
That's good. So
use it once every 10 years. Yeah.
So is natural gas, and I've heard of that happen. That's happening here too. There's lots of all electric homes. And is natural gas, is it bad? I mean, natural gas is not a bad thing, right? I mean, it is pretty clean.
Yeah, I mean, relative to a lot of the other fossil fuels that we've historically used, it's a huge. My understanding from the last set of data that I was looking at is, relative to coal in terms of what we're doing from electricity production, it's less than half CO2 emissions on a per megawatt basis. So it's tremendously clean relative to other of the liquid fuels or solid fuels, and they're, to me, I think it has its place. I think that, just like anything that we were doing, until we got to a point where, we have just a massive oversupply or critical oversupply, there's this whole idea of us having some diversity in our portfolios. Like if you're investing, you don't want it all in stocks or all in bonds. It definitely has to have a place, I think, in terms of not having all of our eggs in a singular basket. It's a well-proven, reliable source of electricity. We have a tremendous amount of natural gas reserves here in the United States from an energy independence perspective. So I don't know that what the U.S. would look like just topographically if we had solar and wind. Like theoretically, even if we could store all of it, I don't know what that would look like from how much land that would take. And we have a lot here, but there's definitely transmission line access and some of the things. So I do think natural gas has to play a part, at least until we get to very, very mature aspects of some of these other types of technologies.
We're not actually running out of natural gas, right? I mean, we still have plenty of that.
We are. I mean, some of what I'm seeing today is, for better, for worse, and maybe it was bad actors in some parts of the country, but there's this idea that, fracking in shale gas formations is always bad. And, I don't think that that's necessarily true, but we have a tremendous, we have huge reserves. There was a shale gas revolution that occurred here, in the early 2000s that just kind of changed the pace of us saying, oh, there's a lot more resources here than we thought there were. So there's a tremendous amount of gas. I don't think, at least I should worry about us running out, or my children should worry about it running out in their lifetimes. It doesn't mean that we don't need to be judicious about what we're using and be as efficient and as conservation minded as we can be. But yeah, I think sometimes it takes us maybe a little bit of time to ramp up getting access to it, but it's all there waiting in the ground. So,
right. And what about geothermal and any other sources like that? How are we doing on tapping those things?
Yeah,
like
I love that idea, the idea of geothermal. And there's certainly some places where the geology lends itself to that, where we have easy access to some of those resources. There's places like Iceland that have direct access, and I think that the vast majority of their electricity and energy production is geothermal based. Years and years ago, I had someone walk into my office, and it was one of the coolest ideas about folks being able to drill into these hot rock formations to create geothermal, and I'd love to see that be a reality. That's That would be a really interesting technology that takes advantage of that. It's maybe not a renewable resource, but it's a vastly greater resource that we're not going to deplete in the conceivable future. And so I think that, again, these are these things where you have these technological innovations where someone, can we build drilling technology to get down into these very hot areas, inject water, and then use that steam to power steam turbines. I think that that's, again, it's a technology that's waiting to be commercialized, and have smart young people that figure these things out and devote their time, effort, and attention to making that a reality for the benefit of all of us.
Yeah, I just get this feeling that everyone is sort of concerned about energy, and I feel like there's energy all around us. I mean, there's so much energy that's being generated by not just the planet, but we are as well. I mean, despite the whole matrix concept, we generate energy, and I was thinking at some point we'd actually be able to, if the devices got efficient enough, we'd be able to generate electricity to run all of our devices that at least are near us, like my Apple Watch or something like that. I mean, do you see that happening at some
It's
point?
interesting. I saw something some time ago about a wearable fabric, just even in your clothing, that was able to, just from you moving your body and the push and pull, would generate these microcurrents, and it was able to do that. But yeah, if you could get the efficiency down to these very, 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 very low types of efficiencies, then we might be able to get there all around. And we really haven't talked about, I mean, there's a vast amount of energy that's stored in the oceans, just the difference between temperatures at the surface and temperatures at depth. I know a lot of things have been trying to harness tidal energies, and there's definitely issues and logistics around that too. But we just have vast access to the types of, and these are vast quantities of energy. They're difficult for us to harness and transmit and, get them in line with the way we consume them. But given the scale of what our actual energy needs are, we think of them as huge in a global sense, like the global energy balance. They're really not that large. So yes, I do think that this is where I'm kind of an eternal optimist around folks. If they're provided the appropriate economic incentive, and we have a culture that really incents supporting innovation, whether that's bringing young people into STEM, allowing folks to come to this country to pursue those types of things. That's how we'll get there. And I'm perpetually optimistic about these things.
So I read the other day that somebody did a study of electric vehicles because they wanted to look at what would happen, how many electric vehicles could the American grid support, and they said something like 25 million. That seems really like a low number to me. Is that an incorrect number?
No, I think it's, there's a lot of speculation, and there are a lot of assumptions about how this will all work. I think, a good example of that is to say, is home charging really viable? And so if you're someone that's, commuting 100 miles each way every day, and you have 110,
that's pretty normal around here, by the way.
Yeah, that's probably true. But if you're like in suburban Chicago or something like that, and you have your vehicle, and maybe you're putting 30 miles a day on your car, and maybe you take a trip every now and then, the amount of electricity you need and that infrastructure capacity for you to top up overnight is maybe one thing. But there's a real issue with, if you're trying to fully charge an electric vehicle every day from 0 to 100 or whatever that is, not only is there a time problem, but if everyone's leaning on the infrastructure that way, it's not really built. We didn't legacy design all of our infrastructure to handle that. So, here we see this a lot, where there might be to a home a 200 amp service. And if you look at all of the demands in that house between the air conditioner and, electric clothes dryer, it can't support adding in some of these other things, which I know this is all part of, the new codes and what are we doing on a going forward basis. But it may end up meaning that some folks are kind of left behind. Like, you may have a hard time retrofitting that into some apartments or some of these other areas. So I think it's a real concern, and it's a real issue around okay, how is charging actually done? Do we have centralized charging locations where it's fast charging? We build infrastructure specific to that. It's very efficient. You get people in and out. Maybe it's at the movie theater, or maybe it's at the dry cleaners, or places that people are going to go anyway, where I'm going to go have dinner, supercharge my car, and head home, and I'm good, right? So is it home charging, or is it going to be these other types of solutions? So the more centralized charging we have, I think the easier it is to accommodate, from an infrastructure perspective, larger numbers of adoptees of those types of technologies to allow the infrastructure more time to catch up. We definitely still have this ongoing issue where there's that whole idea of not in my backyard, where the reality is you can't build new power generation, whether it's natural gas or whether it's wind or whether it's solar. You can't build those in the dense urban areas. So you have to have the transmission infrastructure, the electric lines infrastructure to get that supply into those areas. And we see this sometimes in the pipeline business and in natural gas and crude oil. Is it's unbelievably difficult and expensive and time consuming to try to put these projects in place. So we may really have a big infrastructure problem, to say nothing of having the absolute supply that might be needed. But again, I think these are things that if we're trying to, skip to the end quickly, we're going to have a problem. If we let this kind of evolve over time in the way, proceed at best pace, I think that there are definitely, you can get where you want to get to, but we just got to be careful about trying to push some of these things faster than they're really technically able to be done.
Yeah, I think we're going to get to the point where there might be a convergence of sort of the autonomous vehicle and the charging centers, so that you can just sort of have your autonomous vehicle drive to the charging center, charge itself over there, and then come back
100%.
to
That's
you.
what I thought. I mean, think about, as you think about the oil majors, and all these companies are reinventing themselves, and appropriately so, as energy companies. That's really what they need to think of themselves as. How much real estate does Chevron and Exxon and Shell and BP, how much real estate do those guys have that's service stations? And if you had autonomous vehicles that could take off at 3 o'clock in the morning, drive themselves to these centralized locations where they could build the infrastructure for that, charge themselves and be back at your house in the morning, good to go, that seems to make sense. That may be a far way away, but the possibility of running into a human driver at 3 o'clock in the morning in these other areas is probably a lot less. So you're reducing the risk, associated with allowing some of that to happen. So I think that someone smart will figure that out. And I think that what you're thinking is probably way more of a reality than people think it is.
Yeah. Plus, actually, I wouldn't mind it walking way, right? I wouldn't mind walking to it if it's not too far away.
For sure.
So I have a question. You were talking about nuclear earlier, and I know there's a lot of political sort of backlash against nuclear, but aren't there other countries out there that are using like new clean nuclear plants? Or I know I'm originally Canadian, so I know Canada has got the CANDU reactor or whatever. Where are we at with nuclear? Is it on the wane? Is it in ascendant in other places? Or I mean, isn't that sort of like the strongest candidate for sort of creating like tons of energy?
In my view, I think that nuclear has to be part of the solution. I wholeheartely understand the reservations that people have about sort of the legacy of the historical nuclear energy industry. And I think that those concerns are 100% well-founded. They may be a little antiquated now in terms of what's happened and where the state of the art is today versus where it is before, but the reality is the industry has to own that. I do have some concerns. So when we talk about nuclear energy as being part of the solution, there's no question that that's the case. Nuclear, I don't know, is appropriate to use to do it the way we've done it before. And so I think some of the earlier generations of some of our existing nuclear power plants here in the United States that are approaching 50 years old, and some of those others. At some point, you really do need to stop kicking the can down the road on some of those designs. A lot of our nuclear industry here was, we're not just making electricity, we're making, we're making other things available in national security interests associated with us having access to other types of radioisotopes that we're making in those. So they weren't 100% about electricity, or at least, to begin with. But yeah, there are, the CANDU reactors is a little bit of a derivative of the legacy technology, but it's still kind of antiquated. But there are a number of other models that are out there. I mean, we've seen stuff. I know that even all the way to the Gates Foundation, there's small modular reactors, much smaller types of things. If you're designing from scratch, you can build fail-safe or reactors that are designed in such a way that if they lose power, they shut themselves down. Like they have these positive safety loops associated with them, all the way through to other types of nuclear fuels, whether that's on the table or not. Thorium is about twice as abundant as uranium is. And you can certainly, we did it here in the United States in the 60s, test reactors with thorium reactors, and they have, very little proliferation risk, and they have these, positive aspects. So I think what we'll see is we have so much regulatory morass with the United States and in Canada as well, and maybe even Western Europe, that what's going to happen is I think that we'll have another emerging economy somewhere else in the world, whether it's in Canada or India, where there's a great leap forward in technological innovation, where they prove some of these alternative technologies and can prove through the safety record. And then we will adopt those back here. It's kind of that strange thing where we always think of ourselves as leading from the front, but I suspect that what we'll see is in some of these other places where energy, maybe more of a crisis, maybe fewer options there, that they're really looking for ways to move forward. So I suspect that's what you'll see. And that's probably just given the structure that we're dealing with here and how hard it is to get people to move forward with new thinking. And we've had, almost disastrous types of, our most recent forays into some of this. There were some new reactors that were built in the southeastern United States, a next gen reactor that they started construction before they finished all the designs. And, the OEM contractor there ended up going bankrupt, and it's just, it was a mess. They didn't get it finished right. So it was a better mousetrap on top of the legacy designs, but there may be a need to really think from the top to bottom and really start with a fresh sheet of paper on how can we make these things happen, make them simpler and maybe even smaller, and really focus on safety and proliferation as the main issues that we're dealing with there. So I think there are solutions.
Yeah. Well, I'm waiting for the nuclear-powered automobile. I don't know when that's coming, but now it's time to think like a futurist. It's the year 2032. It's 10 years from now. Are we going to be a lot further along in 10 years on the energy front, or are we going to be like close to where we are today? I mean, how quickly are things changing?
I think that if we run into sustained higher overall commodity energy prices, necessity becomes the mother of invention. And, absent a lot of regulatory handcuffing and us, and there's absolutely an appropriate amount of oversight and making sure things are done correctly. But, I think that necessity breeds invention and really increases the sense of urgency associated with commercializing these technologies. So, I think that we are really waiting for a breakthrough in energy storage. And that is going to be really probably one of the most important tent poles for us really transforming what we're doing. And it's very difficult to understand kind of where we are in that continuum. But, if you, as a futurist, I know that, you probably have your ear very much to the ground on all the things that are happening there. And you can look at technological breakthroughs that were, identified in the laboratory setting, making their way into the commercialization realm over time. And these are discoveries that were made 5, 6, 7 years ago that are just now starting to get into that mix. So, if we have a relatively low cost, massive abundance of electricity, I think the sense of urgency might say, hey, we're beyond 10 years on some of these things just because it's going to be harder to organize capital around that. But if we're really dealing with, hey, we have recession and difficult times, and we have huge increases in inflation and commodity costs, it's going to spur the innovation faster than I think we would see otherwise. So, that's maybe the silver lining. I said I was an optimist, but I think that is, perhaps the silver lining there is that, when the chips get down on us as a people, collectively, as a species, we seem to kind of do our best work. So I suspect that if we have more discombobulation, I think that actually hastens the solutions.
Yeah, I think crises bring out the best in us, unfortunately. Sure. So,
right, we do our best work.
Is there any? Yeah. Exactly. Like I always used to wait until the last minute before I submitted a paper, so I'd make sure I use that energy.
It's always top marks too, I'm sure. So
exactly.
The fear of failure.
So you got it. So, is there any particular battery technology that's like super exciting and it's on the edge of becoming real that you're experiencing?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of those that I think are kind of interesting. I think, I think it's important. What we're seeing in Texas and some of the other places is we're seeing grid scale batteries that are there. We're still really far away from them being meaningful from an impact perspective on the system, but there's a lot of lithium ion types of grid scale battery solutions that I find baffling personally. It's I think that the appropriate thing about some of these the lithium ion or lithium derivative types of batteries that are out there, they're super valuable in terms of their energy density to weight. And so I can see them having a huge amount of impact and really allowed us to have a practical electric transportation infrastructure set of solutions, which they make much more sense on a density to weight perspective. But for stationary batteries that are kind of sitting in one location, and it doesn't matter if they weigh 100 million tons or 50 million tons, to me it's somewhat baffling that we see some of those resources used for those types of technologies. I know they have better characteristics in terms of how quickly you can discharge and things of that nature, but I think that there's probably was watching a presentation / reading a report. A gentleman running a lab at MIT had some liquid metal batteries. Very interesting, taking.
What kind of liquid? What kind of metal?
I think calcium was one of them, and then you got salts as the
interesting
ion exchange membrane, and then I can't remember what the other one he was using. And you have regular anodes and cathodes. So as you charge them, you add heat back into that system, which retains that heat, and then in the discharge cycle, I think they'd run studies about even if you let them freeze or go back to room temperature, you can get them back into a molten state, and they have almost.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah, so. I mean, there's places like maybe in Alaska, that's not a great thing, just in terms of trying to, retain heat loss, but maybe in the deserts, desert areas, or like here in Houston or out in, the deserts of Arizona or California, that makes a lot of sense. The thing I really liked about that is it allows you, there's calcium in the soils everywhere. Our ability to, they're cheap materials. And I think that's going to be one of the key things for us is, if we have to, mine something in the Congo and bring it over here and all the things that happen with that, as you pointed out, okay, what does it cost for us to build an electric vehicle? And we're saving the earth, but, we're destroying it, making them, and then how are we charging them? Having some of these other ideas on sustainability and really localization of those things is an awesome idea. Now, I don't know how far away that is, from really being commercializable, but those are neat technologies. I think that, other types of battery technologies in the flow design, right? So you have your electrolyte that runs between your anode and cathode, and you almost store it as, it's retained in a fluid, and you can discharge that fluid, and you can bring that fluid in other places. So it's almost like, as your charged electrolyte it's almost like a liquid fuel, and so you can exchange that out and use that. So I think the flow designs, because of maybe some of their inherent benefits there, and then in a stationary setting, you have a lot more room for locations and balance of plant machinery and things of that nature to make that a reality versus trying to fit that all into a transportation mode. So I'm super optimistic around the emergence of these storage technologies, especially for steady state or in-ground grid scale, or even sitting on the back end of a home, from a resiliency perspective or some kind of a buffer there. I think that there's some neat things that can happen there, but I think it needs to happen at the grid scale first, and I do think it will be something other than lithium ion or lithium based technologies.
So that's where startup founders should be focusing their efforts, is on some new breakthroughs in battery tech.
I think so. I think that's the key. That's the big stumbling block. If you could do that, the single largest characteristic that makes electricity different from all the other energy resources, you can put crude oil on a ship, you can store it, you can put natural gas in an underground storage cavern, but you just can't do that with electricity. And it lends itself towards scarcity, and it lends itself towards volatility. And solving that issue for electricity, given how important it is for our modern lifestyle and way of life, and all the investment that's made in infrastructure to support that delivery model, I think it's a change the world type of technology. And there's not a whole lot of those, but that's definitely one of them.
Nice. Well, if you want to dent the universe, that's the place to go, right?
I would.
Excellent. So thanks so much. This has been great. Very fascinating. I love this stuff. And so if somebody wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
Check us out on Facebook at EnergyOgre.com. Usually if you send something off to the folks there, you can get in touch with me as well. I try to maintain a zero footprint in social media. Everyone does
smart guy. You're a smart man.
I'm gonna catch up with you on Facebook. I assure you are not, or Instagram. So I'm busy enough with these types of things, and with my kids. So I don't have the time or inclination to make that a priority.
Sounds good. Well, I'll put the links in to EnergyOgre in the show notes. And it's been great talking with you. Thanks so much.
Enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.